Assalamu alaikum
Wa alaikum assalam.
wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu.
Yes, indeed. Yes, I look forward to the possibility of us doing this in the same room one evening during Ramadan, inshallah.
Sure.
Yeah.
I know that the MSA asked to do it in their presence at some point.
Oh, that would be lovely. Maybe I can come down to South Bend and we can do that, inshallah.
That'd be
Yeah,
amazing.
that'd be lovely.
Sure. So tonight is a heavy night. We have
So tonight is the 10th portion. And just for those of you who may be just joining us for the first time tonight, so what we're doing during these nights of Ramadan is we are having a sincere and honest encounter with the Qur'an, and we're following the Qur'an in 30 different portions. We know that these portions are not the official portioning of the book or the official organization of the book, but this was a way that the tradition tried to make it possible for people to portion out the Qur'an over the 30 nights of Ramadan. And as we do so, we are, because the Qur'an was revealed little by little over 23 years, we are moving in time. The Qur'an, as those of you who know it well, know that the Qur'an is not a linear book with a start, a middle, and a finish. It's more of a circular book and a non-linear text. So it's a very unusual kind of book. And the organization of the Qur'an is not in a strict chronological fashion. In fact, it's generally counter-chronological, meaning that the latest of those 23-year revelations are kind of toward the beginning of the Qur'an, and the earliest of those revelations are toward the end of the Qur'an. Although there is some jumping, and one of the surahs that we'll be talking about tonight, Surah At-Tawbah, is really one of the very latest portions of the Qur'an, even though it's it's appearing now on the 10th night of Ramadan. So as we journey through, we always welcome your questions, your comments. If we can't get to them tonight, we'll certainly begin tomorrow night with them. And the goal is not to do everything. This isn't a complete reading of the Quran. This is just an opportunity for us to engage the Quran piously and critically, not in the sense of criticizing the Quran, but with sharp minds, really kind of intellectually trying to understand what's going on and to reflect some of the teachings that we've received from scholars over the years, and looking at the Arabic, but mostly looking at the English, because we know that we can't assume that everybody is engaging in the Quran in Arabic. But this is really an opportunity for us to, in a way, to hold up and to celebrate the Quran, because before the month of Ramadan was a month of fasting, it was the blessed month in which the Quran was gifted to humankind through the Archangel Gabriel and the Prophet Muhammad, and so upon him be peace. And so these nights of unscripted Ramadan, these nights are really just opportunities for us to re-engage the text of the Quran with our eyes wide open and our minds awake, and with, by God's grace, with food in our stomachs, so that we can really focus and ponder and struggle sometimes with what the Quran is presenting us.
Yeah, and tonight there's some things to struggle with, because there'll be a twist. And we'll.
The mission and vision of the American Islamic College, to me, pretty much now synonymous with the work. I believe in the transformative power of education, and not just education that is informative, but in education that is transformative, education that really changes how we live. But I think that the Muslims of America need a place that they can come as a Muslim space. This is their space. It belongs to them.
Yeah, so I was just mentioning the twist. Surah Al-Anfal is now again a Medinan surah, early in Medina, and it begins with an issue when the struggle of the Prophet turned to armed conflict.
Yeah.
And the issue of the spoils of war came up. So the first thing that we have to realize is the Medinan context is one that's completely different from the Meccan. In the Meccan, there was more persecution, and there was eventually emigration from there, and there wasn't any real resistance. But now in the Medinan context, there will be resistance that will lead ultimately to the conquest of Mecca and the taking of most of Arabia by the Prophet and his companions. And so Al-Anfal is the beginning of that period in Medina where the conflict becomes an armed conflict. And At-Tawbah, which is the surah that comes second in the couplet, if you will, the pairing of these two surahs, is right at the end of the period in Medina when it comes to the conquest. And we will see also that the ordering of the surahs is interestingly arranged, wherein the issue of the spoils of war is brought at the beginning of the surah, but then you'll go chronologically backwards to before the battle and the lead up to the battle, because the spoils come at the end. And then when we look at the second surah, At-Tawbah, post-conquest moment is brought in front of the surah. And then the pre-conquest moment is discussed leading up to it. And then ultimately what happens in the second part of the surah at the end of At-Tawbah is after the conquest of Mecca, going beyond the holy city into the rest of Arabia. So there's an interesting, there's a thematic kind of layering here and sequencing that one must be mindful of. So I'm just going to maybe just produce a litany of things from Al-Anfal, if that's all right.
Sure.
And we can talk about any one of those and then go into Tawbah. The interesting thing with Tawbah, the twist, is that it's the only surah where the basmala, the formula that's pronounced at the beginning of every surah, Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim, in the name of God, most compassionate, most merciful, that doesn't appear. And there's a few reasons for that, which we'll talk about when we get to that surah. Some of it might be apparent almost leading up to it. But there is one opinion in the tradition that these are actually not two, but a single surah, not two surahs, but one. And that's one of the reasons why that the basmala is not there. But for the most part, it's accepted as a separate surah, and a different reason is given for the absence of that formula of beginning in the name of God with his attributes of compassion, compassionate, and merciful. So, let's just begin. Al-Anfal, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. They ask thee concerning the spoils of war. So that's how it begins very directly. Say that it is a matter for God and his messenger. So be mindful of God and make things right between yourselves. And obey God and his messenger if you are true believers. So there's a centralization taking place. Like with the tribes, whatever the warriors would collect would belong to them. But now it's a collective effort, and there's a shared governance, and the spoils are being centralized in their distribution as well. So not all of them, but portions of them. So those instructions are going to come in the surah later on. But the issue has been fronted at the beginning. And then
you've noted this before, that the Quran is responding to real-time questions that people are bringing to the Prophet ﷺ. So upon him be peace. So this is one of many episodes where we see the Quran responding to questions that people are bringing to the Prophet.
Right. That's right. And then I think the next, couple of verses are amongst the most beautiful that I find. True believers are those whose hearts tremble with awe when God is mentioned.
Yeah.
إِذَا ذُكِرَ اللَّهُ وَجِلَتْ قُلُوبُهُمْ. And again, you can relate to this, I feel, is when when the name of a beloved is mentioned, it's striking, right? And it hits you to the core. And so their hearts tremble with awe. And when his verses are recited or his signs are rehearsed, they increase them in faith.
Mm.
Their faith is strengthened and increased. So,
Yeah.
and they are those who put their trust in their Lord, and they establish the regular prayer, and they spend and give to others out of what we have provided for them. They are the true believers.
Yeah.
If you're looking for the mark of a true believer, these are the marks. That your heart trembles with awe with the mention of God, and that you spend out of what has been given to you, and you establish the prayer. And when God's signs are mentioned, there's an increase. You feel you're getting closer.
And don't forget the tawakkul, that total trust and reliance upon God, which means that no matter what challenges you're facing, you have that confidence that God is with you. And this is something that's going to become a life and death issue for some of the original, hearers of the Qur'an and believers in the Qur'an in these chapters.
Yeah. Tawakkalna ala Allah. Yeah, I missed that part. And and who put their trust in their Lord. And believers, when they experience calamity or hardship, this is one of the first things that they will say, or a challenge. Tawakkaltu ala Allah. Tawakkalna ala Allah.
We trust in God.
All right.
Yeah.
Ulaika humul mu'minuna haqqa. I love just the rhythm of the surah, right? Wajilat qulubuhum wa idha tuliyat alayhim ayatuhu zadatuhum imana wa ala rabbihim yatawakkalun. And ulaika alladhina yuqimuna as-salah, right? Wa mimma razaqnahum yunfiqun. Ulaika humul mu'minuna haqqa. Like, these are the true believers. And then it goes straight into Badr, that first major battle. Kama akhraja rabbuka min baytika bil haqq. So, for it was your Lord who made you venture from your home for a true purpose. And then there was a debate between the followers. So these are the events of Badr, that battle, and that encounter is, dramatically and beautifully described. But I want to turn to verse 17, just in the interest of time, to point it out. When the encounter took place on the battlefield, the Qur'an says, it was not you who slew them, وَلَمْ تَقْتُلُوهُمْ وَلَكِنَّ اللَّهَ قَتَلَهُمْ, but it was God who slew them. And when you threw sand at them, the Prophet, picked up sand and hurled it, and it became this kind of sandstorm. So there were these miracles. It was not you who threw, but it was God who threw. So there's this interesting merger between human and divine through the Prophet in action, but it's in action at this decisive moment in battle. And this is something that, when believers, they have to put their life on the line. These are verses that inspire them and keep them going. But you can see how the revelation will serve as a constant reminder that believers can find themselves in this type of situation. And maybe the sequence of verses from 24, I'm going to let you soak some of this in, and then you can pronounce on anything you want. Obviously, you can interrupt anytime. But ya ayyuhalladhina amanu, so, O you who believe, respond to God and his messenger when he calls you to that which gives you life. Know that God comes between a man and his heart. God comes between a man and his heart, and that you will be gathered to him. So I just thought that was an interesting line. What does that mean? I almost don't want to rush through with the litany and want to ask your comment on this. Or anything.
First and foremost, I love this idea that respond to God and His messenger when they call you to that which gives life. You know, the importance of the response. We're going to see, you know, when we read Surah Ar-Rahman and other surahs later on, that the idea that God's benevolence and God's generosity requires a response. You know, it should inspire a response, and this idea of, you know, oh, you who believe, you know, respond to God and His messenger when He calls you to that which gives life. And I love that way of thinking of the religious teachings of Islam, that these are, and all the prophetic teachings, of course, that God is constantly calling us to that which gives life, and that the essence, and we remind ourselves all the time on Friday prayers that, you know, God doesn't benefit from our prayer, and God doesn't benefit from our fasting, and God doesn't benefit from it, you know, the alms that we give, or anything that we do. All of the instruction that's given to us is given for our benefit, and so I love the way that ayah even just begins. But then, you know, that God comes between a man and his heart. Wow. You know, this also reminds me of the early statement in the Qur'an that God is closer to us than our own jugular vein. That God is so intimately close to us, and that it may be, you know, the heart often in Islamic spirituality is referred to as the sort of the essence of who we are as spiritual beings. And I guess the man, in a way, could refer to our this personality that we've developed, this career that we've developed, this sense of self that we have, and that God could intervene. And often, you know, when we're in violation, when we're living in a way that's in violation of our hearts do speak to us in all kinds of uncomfortable ways. And so, you know, I have to say, I'm thinking about this, you know, just right now. What do you think, Mahan? How does that speak to you?
You know, I was afraid to kind of just go off on my own, so I did look at the study Qur'an on this verse. Let me find it. It's
This
number
24.
24, and it says really close to, I think you're on the right track, at least on the same track as what this says, is that God comes between a man and his heart is interpreted to mean that he comes between a disbeliever and faith. And so there it goes on. This is the first part. And so when I read that, it's, you know, when God lets them go astray or puts a seal on their hearts because of what they have done, right? It's in a way coming between. But then it says, or between a believer and disbelief. So he protects the believer. And so it could be that, or that nothing is hidden from God, even the innermost dimensions of one's being. So if you think whatever is the most private, God is there and knows. And so, you know, oftentimes we act, we do things, and nobody knows what's driven us to them. But God knows. Sometimes even we have something in our subconscious, traumas, impulses that we're not conscious of, but are buried in our subconscious mind. And so God is there and he knows it, and he will exonerate us, right? Because he knows truly that which was driving us. And maybe through us, we became a test for others in spite of ourselves. But in the end, it won't be something that we will be damned for, because God was inside and he knew something much deeper than even we knew about ourselves, as long as we didn't act obviously in malice. So there's all these different layers here. It's just a beautiful
yeah. You know, it also makes me think of of, like Paul of Tarsus, St. Paul, who was an enemy of that early Christian movement until he was knocked off his horse and had a visionary experience. And even Omar, may God be pleased with him, who was an enemy of the Prophet Muhammad. And the Prophet prayed for his conversion because the Prophet saw something valuable and beautiful in him that he didn't see himself. And then, of course, he became not just a member of the believing community, but he became one of the most inspiring members of that community. And so it may be that there's when we say the human being, the man in his heart, maybe it sometimes, in order for us to, even when we think about genocide and acts of oppression, and like a human being who's in touch with his own heart just cannot perpetrate such acts unless he's found a way to override the system, the moral system, within himself. And I think that differentiation between the person and the heart is really interesting, because it kind of opens up that whole, for me, that whole kind of moral landscape where our heart knows what's right, but our mind, and we may have all kinds of reasons why we want to do something else.
Yeah. And you point to this really, the duality, like there's the person and then there's his heart. And these are two different things. And God comes between them. It's just such an interesting imagery there. And it does say here also in this study of Qur'an, we are nearer to him than his jugular vein, that verse it mentions. But it can also mean that God has the power to change hearts, which is what you're saying with St. Paul. As when he changed the example here is change the fear in the hearts of the participants of the Battle of Badr into a sense of security, like tranquility came down upon them. That's right. Rather than its opposite. So God came in between. I was reading an account of this recently, where there's a young girl, she was in occupied territories and taking fire from settlers. And I don't want to get too political here, but they were running because one of their own had fallen, and to go and help, and they were being prevented from approaching the wounded, but they were running despite themselves. And a moment came when there was no fear. It was, and this is how the memoirs, it was. You could hear they said I could hear the whizzing of the bullets and the stone shattering next to me. And this is an 11-year-old girl. Wow. And she said, I had no more fear. Just running to her uncle. Wow. Who ended up not making it. But this is another story. But it's just a reminder that, in conditions, maybe there's something that intervenes. I'm mindful of time, so there's a few verses here that come about fitna, and then we just wrap up with this surah and try to get to a Tawbah, so we can advance in the juz. But if you look at the next verse, this is 25. It says, and beware of discord that harms not only the wrongdoers among you. So this is typically been taken as, when God brings some kind of a trial or a punishment on a collective, there are innocents who also are swept up in that trial. And this is where they're being told, to seek, beware of wattaqu, right? Fear, tumult, or oppression that affects not only particularly those of you who do wrong, but it sweeps up some innocence. And so when evil is coming, or some hardships are coming, or trials are coming, to people who have done wrong, you still seek
Mm.
protection from it,
Yeah.
because for the sake of the innocent. So that's one kind of fitna. And there's three fitnas kind of mentioned here. In verse number 28, I'm just going to jump. It says, and know that your possessions, amwalukum, and your children are a fitna. So the same word, the discord, that's the trial that comes to the collective. Now it's saying that your wealth is a trial, and your children, your offspring, are a trial. But the ultimate reward is with God.
And why Mahan, in this context of the threat of battle and the threat of war, like what is the fitna there of one's family and one's wealth?
It's a trial, because we will see actually this brings us to the theme in Surah Tawbah, that the people who are wealthy didn't want to go out
Right.
for battle. They're like, exempt us. And we see that here, like draft dodgers, and they send other people to war. And so the wealth there has become a trial, because you've got so much to lose, right? And you don't even give it to those who are in need. This is the test. Like, it's not yours. God gave it to you as a trust. And so it becomes a test. See, what we think is the wealth is a reward. It's because I did so great. God has blessed me. No. He's trying you. He's testing you, right? And so that's the fitna. I think the literal meaning of fitna is the kind of when they used to the alchemists used to test whether it's real gold or not. And so this is the test, right? Were you really a believer, or are you really in it for the world? And then the awlad, the offspring, it's the same. You have to remember, we're in a tribal context, and your tribe is, and your children are your wealth, because that's your strength.
Yeah.
And so what you do is you try to, you may not fully be ready for the sacrifice and the trust that it's needed, that you're supposed to put in God, because you're trying to protect your flock when times get difficult.
And yet the divine punishment here is that whatever you spend, whatever you give to God, God will return to you. God will not be unjust with you. And so even the idea that you could lose your life in fighting or striving in God's way for the faith, that no life will ever be lost, and no wealth will ever be lost by sanctifying it and giving it to God.
That's the idea. You spend, and that's what it means to spend in God's way.
Yeah. And
then just jumping to verse 39, there's another use of fitna, the same word, this test or trial. وَقَاتِلُوهُمْ. So believers, fight them until there is no more fitna. So there's a third meaning of the fitna, where it could be tyranny or injustice or oppression, right? The translation here is persecution, and another translation says tumult or oppression.
Mm-hmm.
And the deen and all worship, and there prevail justice and faith, the two different translations, in God altogether and everywhere. وَيَكُونَ الدِّينُ كُلُّهُ لِلَّهِ.
That's right.
But
the entirety of the religion.
Yeah. And so these verses freak people out. Let's just kind of
but that verse we have to finish the verse, because
all right,
the ending of the verse is great.
It is. It's nice. How if they cease, right?
If they stop fighting you.
If they stop fighting you,
then stop.
Then stop.
So we're not looking at, I remember, and I told you about this before, when when I first had a chance to really get to know that great Quranic scholar, Mahmoud Ayub, may God be merciful to him, who's now passed into his Lord's mercy. I was still grappling, like, with the idea that there is such a thing as religiously sanctioned violence in the Quran. And he told me, Timothy, this was a blind scholar of Quranic studies who grew up in a one-room dirt floor house in southern Lebanon and went to Harvard and did his PhD at Harvard. He told me that had someone told him as a boy that he would go to Harvard, it was like telling him he would go to the moon, like it was impossible. But anyway, he did his PhD at Harvard and became a beloved teacher of many of us. I don't know if you had a chance to study with him at Hartford or not when he was there, but he was.
I hung out with him at the GTU with Dr. Munir Jiwa for a while.
Wow.
The guy in Berkeley, we had him over as a visiting scholar when I was at Zaytuna.
Wow. And anyway, he was a profound scholar and a beloved person, and he told me, no, that the Quran speaks of violence in order to restrain it, in order to make sure that there is no part of life, including conflict, which is outside of God's law. And God's law enters into the conversation not to promote the violence, but to restrain the violence. And so here we have this verse that begins very aggressively, and fight them, right? And then it ends saying, but if they stop fighting you, then just stop fighting.
Right.
God sees all that they do.
That actually connects nicely with this last portion. This is verse 61. But if they incline towards peace, you must also incline towards it.
Yeah.
And put your trust in God. Because ultimately, it comes down to trusting the other party. And you can never fully trust the other party, especially when there's enmity and fighting and now, fragile peace. But I love this, and put your trust in God, because, don't try to, if you're going to wait until you can fully trust the enemy, you're never going to get there. And so go as far as you can, and ultimately put your trust in God, not in any other place. Innahu huwa Sami'ul Alim. Yeah, Sami'ul Alim.
He's the one who hears. We have that same dynamic, because the ayah that comes just before it, again, is very aggressive. Like, fight them, and be vigorous in the fight. And then we get to that beautiful verse in 61. But if they incline toward peace, right?
Yeah.
Then incline toward peace. And so there's this beautiful, and it's like a yin yang. It's a complete circle. And so for anyone to read the ayah 60 and not read ayah 61, and then to use one verse from the Quran, cherry pick it, and to say, oh, see what they believe, see how aggressive they are, they're not being faithful to the context of what's happening here, because the verse that comes right after that says, but if they incline toward peace, then you incline toward peace.
Yeah. There's a couple of comments here. One is, as we kind of come to the end of the surah, it's important to note that qatilu is, fa'ilu ala wazn mufa'ala. So it's a mutuality. It's not, one directional violence, but there's two sides here, and that are engaged in this. So that's important. Another comment that had come earlier was when we were talking about when you threw, it wasn't you threw, but God who threw, and you didn't slay, but God who slew. The Hadith Qudsi, we were reminded of that Hadith Qudsi, where if you come closer to God with the acts of devotion, the fara'id, and then the nawafil, it comes to a point where my servant continue to draw near to me until I am his hearing with which he hears, the seeing with which he sees, and the hand with which he strikes, and the foot with which he walks. So there's deeply a spiritual hadith and a relationality that a believer is able to develop with the divine that transcends, I think, our capacity to grasp it fully rationally.
Yeah. This is really truly the mystery of theocentric living, right? Is this idea that, and the mystics talk about the heart. We haven't quite dealt with it explicitly here yet, but when Mecca surrendered to the Muslims, to the Prophet, and to his companions, the first thing he did, one, is he forgave almost everyone in Mecca who had opposed him, but two, he cleansed the Kaaba of all of the hundreds of idols that had been packed inside there. And so it was restored as a house for the one God. And so the mystics talk about the heart is like the Kaaba, that the heart has to be cleansed of all of its idols so that it becomes the dwelling place of God and only God. And when a person has done that work, that psychological and spiritual work, to truly cleanse the heart and to sanctify it for God's presence, then human life and the human being looks completely different from what we're used to seeing and what we're used to experiencing, even with ourselves. And so at that moment, right, that's where the mystery of God bearing witness that there is no God but God, and that the prayer becomes almost a recital of God bearing witness that there is no God but God, and the human being then becomes a conduit through which these beautiful qualities of God manifest in the world. But this is far beyond, I can't speak for you. I can just say it's far beyond Timothy at this moment in my own spiritual journey. But those beautiful indications are waiting for us, inshallah, down the road.
Inshallah. That was beautifully put. Thank you. Thank you for that. I suppose we'll wrap up the surah, just maybe with the last two verses, because you can see this formula repeats. So those who believed and emigrated. So at one point they had to leave their homes. It's sometimes called a flight, to find security and a new home in Medina, but it became a new base from which they could then come back and ultimately reclaim the home from which they had left by God's command. But those who emigrated, wajahadu, and they strove and struggled for God's cause, fi sabilillah, and those who gave them refuge and help. Ulaika humul mu'minuna haqqa.
These are the real
They are
ones.
the true believers.
Yeah.
They participated. They didn't sit back on the sidelines, but they participated in a struggle. And this is where a lot of Islamism, drives its inspiration, that the prophetic, the Prophet's life was a movement of liberation and of a restoration of things that are good and pure in a land that had forgotten, what it meant to have mercy and benevolence and purity of faith. So this is the movement that you strive in God's way, and that requires emigrating and the loss of life, putting your life on the line. And those are the true believers, and for them is forgiveness and rizqun kareem, a generous provision.
Yeah.
But it says then, وَالَّذِينَ آمَنُوا مِن بَعْدٍ. So those who became believers afterwards, like if you didn't participate in this, but you saw the glory of the victory and the peace that it had brought. And so if for those who believed afterwards and emigrated and struggled alongside you, thereafter, they are part of you. Include them.
Yeah.
Don't exclude them. But relatives, and this was interesting to me, wa ulul arham ba'duhum awla bi ba'd fi kitabillah. So in the book of God, relatives still have prior claim over one another, despite this new affiliation that you have through a solidarity in a shared struggle. And this brings me back to when we looked at Al-Anfal, maybe. وَاتَّقُوا اللَّهَ الَّذِي تَسَاءَلُونَ بِهِ. So have regard for God, in whose name you ask of each other, and have regard for the wombs that bore you. So there's something very important about those relations that are blood ties.
Yeah. And yet in the very next surah, in Surah At-Tawbah, we also see that if those relatives are not part of the religious community, if they're not believers, then do not take them as your protectors.
Right.
And so I think that the next surah Tawbah, you can feel the heat is turning up. You can feel that the situation is getting more dire, and so we're seeing people who all these people who want exemptions, as you said. We see people who are breaking their oaths, with the Prophet. We see people who are betraying the agreements, and then we also see a caution that, if your relatives are not part of this, this monotheistic movement and community, then do not take them as your protectors, as your allies in a way.
No, that's
it.
So let me ask you then directly, why do you think there is no basmala, the formula for God's beginning in the name of God and the mercy at the beginning of this surah?
That I refuse the theory that this is a moment when there could be no rahmah, because we read that God has written rahmah upon himself, so that rahmah is, next to God's unity, tawheed, next to affirming God's unity, there perhaps is no more important attribute of God than rahmah. And I understand that all of the attributes are working together and are inseparable in some ways from each other. And so I have to say that I as a amateur reader of the Qur'an and engager of the Qur'an, I don't know. I mean, I'm hesitant to theorize, but I have to say that the idea that that the situation had gotten so dire when this chapter was revealed that there could be no affirmation of God's rahmah. I don't know. I have difficulty accepting that.
So I do have a theory.
Okay.
Let me preface it by, we're not in this juz yet. This is juz 11 tomorrow night when the surah ends. It ends on a note of mercy. It's very interesting. It says, a messenger has come to you from amongst yourself. لَقَدْ جَاءَكُمْ رَسُولٌ مِّنْ أَنفُسِكُمْ. Your suffering distresses him. He is deeply concerned for you. Harisun alaykum. He's deeply concerned for you. Full of kindness. Bil mu'minina ra'ufur rahim. So the rahmah is not in the front, but it's in the back. And it's not from God.
It's from the messenger.
It's from the messenger. And it's not for everybody. It's for the believers. And so with that preface, I'm just going on text here. Okay, this is text reading. This is text reading. So you know how we read in Al-A'raf, the messengers came. We actually didn't read about each of the messengers, but they said, the messenger came and said, believe I'm a messenger of God unto you, so worship God alone. And then they would reject the messenger. And then they would be punished collectively. And so in this surah, the time for the punishment of the Quraysh who rejected the Prophet, like the peoples before had rejected their prophets, their time for their punishment has come. And so this is why the mercy for that moment in history is punishment time. And God is always merciful in a metaphysical, transcendent way, but in history, it had come time for the people who had rejected the prophet to be punished. And so this surah, it begins without that basmala, and in the beginning it's like bara'atun min Allahi wa rasulihi ila allazina a'tum min mushrikeen. So all the treaties and all are done now. Time is up, and you get the infamous sword verse. Like they're given 4 months to kind of think about it, and then verse 9:5 is called the sword verse. Is that when the sacred forbidden months are over, wherever you encounter the idolaters, it's very, very strong. Faqtulu, like now it's time to slay them, kill them, seize them, besiege them, wait for them at every lookout post. But if they turn to God and maintain the prayer and pay the prescribed alms, let them go their way. For God is forgiving, most merciful. So they have to make a choice. And when we read a number of these verses about peace, like the one we read right a moment ago, that if they incline for peace, you incline for peace. A lot of the exegetical material says all of these verses have been abrogated by the sword verse, because chronologically this verse comes later and supersedes. And this verse is very, very troubling if you think it has any application whatsoever today. And I'm deeply troubled by it, and so we have to think about it and take it seriously. It's in scripture, and I don't want to gloss over it. But the way that I understand this, and I got this insight again from Dr. Israr, who offered this reading, is that this is that punishment that is meted out to the followers of prophets when they disobey. Only in the past, it always came through some natural disaster, an earthquake, a storm. But here, and so it's exclusive. It doesn't apply to us. It's just for that. It's like it becomes another story of the messengers. And if you look at verse 14, it says, قَاتِلُوهُمْ. So fight them. يُعَذِّبْهُمُ اللَّهُ بِأَيْدِيهِمْ. So this is that punishment. God is punishing them, but it's not a storm or an earthquake. It's by your hands, by their hands.
Yeah.
And so it's that final kind of moment in a prophetic, in the life of a prophet, but it doesn't apply to those who come afterwards. It becomes a historical account.
So then Dr. Asrar did not accept the idea that one particular verse abrogates all the other instructions with regard to fighting and inclining toward peace if they stop fighting, and then if they incline toward peace.
Right. I can't remember if he said this is the only reading, but he said this is another reading, if you read thematically and textually, that the Qur'an does offer us.
Very interesting. And one of the things that I think we are kind of embodying here is that if there is one way to read the Qur'an, only God knows, only God and the Prophet would know that. And so what we have now, a 1,400 year interpretive tradition, which is still ongoing. So people are still, working out, struggling with these verses, thinking about how to understand particular verses within the wider context of what the Quran is teaching and what the principles of the faith. And so this is a beautiful reading of Dr. Asrar. Did he ever write that down?
He might have, I don't know, but I did.
Okay.
In an article for Building Bridges seminars that we participate in.
I'd love to see that. Yeah. Wow.
Yeah, I can pull it out and share it with you.
Wow.
But as we wrap up here, I think this approaching time, this was a bit heavy. What I want to say is two things. One, remind myself and everybody that, in the latter days of indiscriminate violence. There's context for everything of indiscriminate violence. Be like the better of the two sons of Adam. Like that's also scripture. And the importance of reading things carefully and having a tradition of scholarship and even some responsible kind of readers to help us think through this, because if every random person just picks up the book and finds a verse and takes it completely out of context and then can do great harm. And we've seen a lot of harm come from like you said, cherry picking and reading things out of context and completely violating what is an overall spirit of clearly what we see in God's revelation with the hermeneutic key of mercy.
That's well said. And I think too, one of the dangers of reading a religious text is kind of like in Star Wars when Luke goes into the dark side, the forest, when he's with Yoda, and
the Empire Strikes Back,
and the Empire Strikes Back, and he goes into the cave, and he's told that the only evil that he need fear is what he brings with him. And so sometimes when we are engaging a text, we're the ones who bring the wrong hermeneutical key. We might be angry. We might be filled with supremacist judgment of other people. We might be egotistical. We might be looking for something to cherry pick in order to inflame and incite our own passions. And I think that this is something that, I've never met anyone who just read a verse in the Bible or in the Qur'an and said, "Oh, yeah, I got to go out and start, harming people," because the desire to do violence was already in their heart. And we know that the Hebrew Bible was used as a justification for the enslavement and the oppression and the genocide of the indigenous peoples here in North America, that they were Bible reading, church going people who felt like this was that now the indigenous peoples of North America were the new Philistines and Canaanites and the peoples of the Old Testament. There's a beautiful book called War in the Hebrew Bible by Susan Neidich, which really begins with Christian sermons comparing the indigenous peoples to the peoples that needed to be totally wiped out in the Old Testament or in the Hebrew Bible. In any case, I think that this is something that we often need to be mindful of. And one of the beautiful things about reading the Qur'an with a partner, the way we're doing it, is that when it seems that we're getting too personal, or it seems that there's a gentle, loving, respectful way to challenge that, and to call one another to a more responsible reading of the text. And so this is, as you know, in the Jewish tradition, the idea of reading the Bible and debating it with your chaver, with your partner, your study partner, is part of their rabbinic training. And I think this is a beautiful practice that we're kind of embodying on these nights of Ramadan.
Yeah, no, I'm really appreciative of it. A friend of mine who became very strongly, enamored by the Sunnah, like he felt everything that he read had literally, eating with your fingers and, just really, deep into a sunnatic practice. He said he found a hadith and he would tell me that the companions yatadarasuna bainahum. So they would have this kind of reciprocal dialogical study with each other. So that's also something that he pointed out to me is very much an Islamic style. And we see many hadith where the Prophet begins with a question, like, do you know why this is? And even the Qur'an, ara'ayta alladhi, although it's a rhetorical type question, but it asks a question and answer form. So I'm really happy we're doing this. Thank you, Dr. Timothy.
Thank you. All right, everyone. So we're almost at the hour. So sorry we went long tonight, but it's all for a higher purpose. And thank you, Dr. Mahan, for all of your wonderful instruction tonight. And thanks to all of you who are with us either now in this moment or at other moments when you'll be engaging this. And we look forward to continuing this journey with the Qur'an in an unscripted, sincere, seeking spirit. And so, God willing, we'll see you tomorrow night, inshallah.
Inshallah. Assalamu alaikum.
Okay, wa alaikum assalam.
Rahmatullah.